I'm glad that I can be here now, and would like to welcome Dr. Anna Piotrowska from the Jagiellonian University in Krakow. Dr. Piotrowska studied musicology at the university, where she teaches now, and at Durham University in England. She focuses mainly on cultural aspects of musical life and the place of music in human societies. Interested in the issues of intersection of musical culture and concepts of race and ethnicity. Anna Piotrowska has published extensively on so-called gypsy music. Among other things, she wrote Gypsy Music in European Culture, which was published by Northeastern University Press in Boston. She received many awards and participates in many important forums. She's currently associated with the Institute of Musicology at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow, and we are very happy to have her with us. Please.
Thank you for that very kind invitation, and thank you for having me here. If you allow me, I will sit and we'll start my presentation. Just a very quick note. I thought I would have more time, so I prepared quite a lot to tell you, but I will try to keep my time, and I will try to talk rather than read so that I can squeeze more. So the close relation between music and self-system has been widely recognized, and as Nicholas Cook said, and here is the quote, "In today's world, deciding what music listen to is a significant part of deciding and announcing to people not just who you want to be, but who you are." And more precisely, from methodological point of view, we deal with identities in music and music in identities. So the first, identities in music, refers to how people see their position in relation to music, social culture roles it implies, for example, as professional musicians, whereas music in identities informs about possibilities how music itself influences self-conceptualization and self-image of an individual as related to their gender, age, nationality, disability, and so on. My presentation is dedicated to self-conceptualization of gypsy musicians. Their lives are so highly involved in music that they usually perceive themselves in relation to music, and music is at the core of a self-identity. Yet the gypsy origins play also extremely important role in their self-perception. Hence they often possess what I tag dual identity. Sometimes I call it double identity, and I think we can talk about it because it's not clear sometimes. It is a concurrent identification as gypsies and as musicians. This dual identity enables them playing music of specific traits, music that is referred to as gypsy music in inverted commas. Sometimes it is called music performed in gypsy style. So music not only serves as the means of expressing this identity of gypsy musicians, or gypsies as musicians, that I would say, but in fact is a reflection of the specific duality. I base my research on guided interviews, and this approach was actually prompted by a few ethnomusicologists stemming from Romania, Bulgaria, so countries where gypsy musicians are quite often encountered, and I focus not on listeners but on musicians. Gypsy, Roma, I will explain later why I use gypsy rather than Roma, but maybe later, as I say. And I focus on their conceptualizations as selves, as musicians and as gypsies. In other words, and I quote from Frith, "It is not the issue how a particular piece of music or a performance reflects the people, but how it produces them, how it creates and constructs an experience, a musical experience, an aesthetic experience." And I refer here to what Tia Denora described as music as a technology of the self, and I find this very persuasive description. So it is connected with the assumption that music, the experience of music as a listener and especially as a practitioner, may give the way of being in the world and making sense of it. Of course, we've got different types of identities. I don't have to remind you, collective, individual, but also in relation to music, various kinds of identities are discussed: ethnic, tribal, regional, national, religious, but also in reference to class, caste, or community. Also, on top of that, sometimes the identities are discussed as multiple identities in music or even hybrid identities. In musicology, and more precisely in ethnomusicology, the links between music and identity are one of the most popular topics nowadays. But the history of research is quite recent. It started only in 1980s with the word identity becoming a buzzword. Interestingly, as Timothy Rice says in his informative article on that, the issue of identity and music was absent in early and even mid-20th century works, musicological and ethnomusicological works of seminal importance. So he says probably there are three reasons why it became so well researched in 1980s. Firstly, because the problem of identity as psychosociological category of analysis became fashionable, because it became welcomed in American universities at that time, and because of the impact of the actual fieldwork experience. So also Timothy Rice, when he writes about the links between music and identity in ethnomusicology, he says there are lots of very important questions we should follow. What is identity and how it is defined and institutionalized? Where does social identity come from? How many identities do musicians, listeners possess? And here is the leaflet which I found last month in Dublin Trinity College, and I really liked it. Who am I and why so many? Immediately. So other questions. How is identity created and what exactly music contributes to identity? For me, identity, self-conceptualization of gypsy musician is not only closely associated with particular circumstances and role frames, which would be essentialist position, but rather than seeing it as fixed, homogeneous, and immutable, I treat it as, and I quote from Free, fluid and in the state of flux, performed rather than given, hybrid, transgressive in norms. So it is mobile, a process, not a thing, a becoming, not a being. And also I see it as a self in process. So in other words, musical identity, or rather I would say identity via music, is, I quote, a particular kind of experience or a way of dealing with a particular kind of experience. Of course, when self-conceptualization, talking about self-conceptualization, we are aware that to varying degrees it is context-specific and domain-specific. Probably one of the most interesting examples of how certain theories deal with that problem is intersectionality by Kimberly Crenshaw, but also Frith calls it a web of identities. And he also talks about the necessary flow from social identity, and I quote, to musical expression and appreciation, which is embedded into the idea that cultural identities are not fixed in any absolute way, but are actively fabricated, made up, created via college, combination, appropriation, and redefinition. And for me, when I talk to gypsy musicians and I analyzed the interviews, it became kind of very evident that they usually emphasize two categories, their ethnicity and their job, but also they are doing it in different ways. So first, the ethnicity of a gypsy. I think I need to explain the problem of gypsy ethnicity. Of course, it's a question of who am I, and the ethnicity as the word, as a concept, is as difficult to explain as the concept of identity. But a lot of authors, when they talk about ethnicity, they underline that it's never a singular identity locus, it's Sandra Wallman, but they also underline that identity can be perceived, ethnicity can be perceived as identity, which is perceived through difference and as a recognition of that difference. Obviously, there are different ways of perceiving that difference, but basically what I'm trying to say is that even among gypsies, there are so many different groups of gypsies which speak different languages, even if we assume that this is one Romani language. There are so many dialects that it really is difficult to communicate easily between different types of Romani. Some of the gypsy groups lost their Romani language. So what I'm trying to say is that even gypsies themselves they are not a homogeneous group. So how they perceive themselves as gypsies is in contrast to non-gypsy, so-called gadzie. This is the word used by the gypsies. Also, the word Roma is their own word. They used to refer to themselves, and I, as not Roma person, not gypsy person, am allowed to use the word gypsy because this is the word I use in my language. So that's one reason I use gypsy, but I will tell you one more reason later on. So, gypsy as musicians is a very interesting case how gypsies conceptualize themselves. It is argued quite often that the Roma gypsies have virtually monopolized certain occupations within European realm. So as blacksmiths, for example, but mostly as musicians, as wandering itinerary musicians. And this is, some say this is the result of, and I quote a quote from Basinger, a result of a cultural division of labor based on color and ethnicity that facilitated the confounding of occupation, ethnicity, race, and class. And we know about, from chronicles and several accounts, that gypsies were known as itinerary musicians already in the medieval times. They were usually entertainers, actually, jugglers and walking on the rope and so on, but also playing music, not singing, because they could not perform in the language of the country they were passing through, so they would only perform in the native Romani, which would be intelligible to their listeners. That's why they were rather instrumentalists, usually fiddlers. And for example, in what is today Romania and Bulgaria, we have the accounts of gypsies as musicians from the 14th century. With time, we know that they moved to urban areas, and gypsies were particularly popular as musicians in cities and towns. And by the late 18th century, studying gypsy as the phenomenon, as a cultural phenomenon, became very popular among European intellectuals. Without going into details, I just want to stress the coincidence that gypsy people actually seize the opportunity that they are so popular that they can organize themselves into some small entrepreneurships. And in Austria territory, which was huge at that time, they organized themselves into musical bands, which I don't like the word, but in German it sounds much better, Zigeunerkapellen. And these Zigeunerkapellen were usually, the name comes usually from the leader. It was enough if the leader was gypsy, and the rest of the lineup could be Austrians, anybody really, and they were very, very popular, and their popularity grew especially during the Vienna Congress in 1815. But what happened in the mid-century, by 1859, is the recognition from Franz Liszt, who was a Hungarian of origin, a composer who was an idol at that time, iconic composer at that time, also a virtuoso, traveling virtuoso. And he actually wrote a book, you can see the second edition here, about gypsies and their music in Hungary. And that book made gypsy music that famous that for gypsies themselves it was the ultimate coronation of their position as musicians. It was unfortunately met with outrage in Hungarian territories because people understood that gypsies did not play Hungarian, did not play Hungarian, truly Hungarian music, but they played a mix of different repertoire. So they mixed anything that would please their listeners. But nevertheless, that was really a breakthrough in the self-conceptualization of gypsies who now saw themselves as proper musicians, not as musicant, meaning someone who is of inferior education. And Liszt's mistake was reminded by Bela Bartok, another composer, Hungarian composer in the early 20th century. He scrutinized Franz Liszt and his mistake, but he said, okay, I understand to a certain degree why Liszt was fascinated with gypsy music, so I forgive him for making that musicians that famous. That's the story of Hungarian gypsy musicians. What about Romania, which is much less talked about? In Romania, gypsy musicians are called lautari, and they organized themselves in, again, bands which were not called Zigeunerkapellen, but tarafs. And taraf means a small band of gypsy musicians, usually gypsy, not always gypsy. And they were very popular in the 20th century, but after the Second World War, when we had dealt with communism, obviously gypsy music was banned. Gypsy music was banned, and the funniest story happened in Bulgaria when it was absolutely banned from public sphere, even though, as it turns out, gypsy music was the one that was featured in all weddings of that time. So I will just play a little bit of Bulgarian gypsy music, if the technology allows. Yes. I don't know how to make it down. I'll just play. Okay, I'll just try to make it maybe here. I don't know how to make
just
it.
Just use this. Let's see. Just lower. Oops.
I always use the mouse. That's my problem.
Here.
Okay, so we can.
So a little less.
Yeah. So. Sorry. Okay. So. Okay. Let's go back to. It was just a very small example to give you idea how it sounds, because I will give you also examples from different countries of Southern and Eastern Europe, and you will see that they are completely different, and that's for the purpose. So.
Why was gypsy music banned in Bulgaria? What was wrong with it?
That was in 1984. There was a governmental decree banning gypsy music because it was a so-called element, and generally if you ask about the post-war situations in socialistic countries, there are at least two reasons why gypsy music was banned from the streets. One reason was that was associated with that type of music making that was popular before the Second World War. So there is a lord who pays, and there is a servant who obeys and performs music. So that was the old type of economy that was banned in communistic countries. That's one reason. And the second reason is that if there were such gypsy bands, this meant that they were so-called private businesses, and private business were really frowned upon. So that was very economical.
So it was gypsy musicians and not gypsy music that was banned?
That was gypsy musicians that were banned from playing their music. So that's what they played. And also on the radio and in official press, that the coverage of gypsy music was very unpleasant, or simply it was silence. It was not written about as it was before. So there was simply silence about that. There was only about gypsy in the coverage, about gypsies, maybe musicians, maybe not, who become proper citizens of a countries, who, for example, organize themselves in special businesses under protectorate of the government. Yes, and especially in Romania, but also in Poland, in Bulgaria, you would have this situation when gypsies were employed as they wanted to show that gypsy music is a part of folklore. So this folkloristic tendency that came from USSR, that you had huge ensembles that presented folklore. So, for example, in Romania, gypsy music was presented as Romanian folklore. So it was like playing with folklore. But also we had that after the 1989, so with the fall of communism, there was this back to streets movement. For example, here you've got a gypsy band in the streets of Zamość, Poland, but also in Krakow and in Budapest. But also I read that in Moscow, for example, now Ruska Roma is present, and I'm not talking about institutionalized gypsy theater in Moscow, but about gypsy musicians going to the streets, feeling that their place is the streets, they belong to the streets. And so far, when I was talking about gypsy musicians, you could have the feeling that being a gypsy was like, it was a story of success. That was no problem. But as I mentioned now and explaining also why gypsy music was unwelcome in the street, obviously being a gypsy, not a gypsy musician, being a gypsy was a story of prejudice and discrimination. So in that situation, being a gypsy musician was a very different story. So you, as a gypsy, you were that was a bad thing to be. You shouldn't be gypsy because gypsies were assimilated, gypsies were persecuted, and so on. But on the other hand, being a gypsy musician meant that you were sought after, that your Zigeunerkapellen would be hired, and you had more gigs to work for if you were a gypsy musician rather than if you were just a musician. So this is very important, that celebrating gypsy musicians is something that comes from outside, from the outside world, from non-gypsy world. So that's why we've got two things. That being a gypsy musician is a thing that you are proud of because you are celebrated outside, but also you are celebrated within your own community. Why are you so celebrated within your own community? It's like a double reflection, because gypsies, they know that the non-gypsy world highly values gypsy musicians. That's why they also value musicians among themselves. So it's like going back to what non-gypsy say about musicians. So now I have a quote from a Turkish gypsy who said recently, after education, I quote, "I wish his son, became a musician. He graduates from School of Music and then he works in Turkish Radio Television Association. What a beautiful thing to become an educated musician." That's what he says. And that's a little bit of what Turkish music sounds like. So you can hear the difference, and you can hear how much it is actually embedded into Turkish music. Oops. Technologically, I'm not very advanced. Oops, sorry. Oh, yes. It's again too loud. But okay, let it be. Oops. That's Okay. 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 Yeah. Thank you. Okay, so what a beautiful thing to become a musician, but what is important here is what is embedded into that interview, that what a beautiful thing is to become a professionally educated musician. So when you read that interview, you might say, okay, that this is a dichotomy which is very often met among these people of lower social status, that they want to upgrade themselves or their children with education. But actually this interview, I read out a little bit differently. What a beautiful thing is to become a musician per se. So it means that to be a musician, no matter whether you are professionally educated or autodidact, is a very important thing for self-conceptualization for a gypsy. So how do you become a gypsy musician if you are a gypsy? So as I said, this is a family influence, and in one of my interviews by Romanian gypsy violinist and composer Aurel Ionita, he says, I'm a lautar. A lautar means I'm a self-educated gypsy musician, like my father, and he prides in being musically trained at home. So what he says, that spontaneity of musical education is extremely important. And yet, at the same time, in the same interview, he says, I've got two sons, and both of them are at music academy. So I want them to be professionally trained. And you could say, oh, this is a paradox. It's not a paradox, because once you become a professionally trained musician, you go to the streets and you want to be appreciated as a musician, but you also play out the role of a gypsy. So this is how they see themselves. And this is very difficult to grasp in one word. As I said, also socialization within the own Romani gypsy group is extremely important. So music is a part of the identity, but also an element on par, I would say, with hairdo, dress, diet, economic system, that actually tells others who you are. That you are a musician means is one of the means of showing to others who you are. And one more thing, which I already mentioned here, this self-hiring economy. This is very important, because you become a musician in gypsy society by self-hiring, and this, some people would claim, and I would say the same, requires very strong self-conceptualization and imagination of who you are and who you want to be, in order not to get confused by the needs of the others that musicians, gypsy musicians, are satisfying. You already heard that they are playing music that is very similar to the music of the countries they come from. This is done to please the audience. So you have to be very, very adamant who you are, not to confuse your music and your position with the others, because then you would be in danger of being accused of you are just another musician. So one of the reasons I want to mention that they are so very, I don't know how to say that, but they are very, very they're very strong making this statement that they are musicians. Proper musicians, when they talk to you, is the recognition. They strive for recognition. They want to be recognized as musicians. So, for example, I'm a musicologist, and I know a lot about music, so they try to impress me with the names of a composer, of techniques, and so on. And also, what is very interesting, they strive for the recognition from other musicians. And I will tell you two stories. One is about Franz Liszt, already mentioned, who in the 19th century met Barbu Lautari in Romania, and there is this story that perpetuates among gypsies till today. So I was told by the gypsies this story, how Liszt was so impressed with the music by that Lautar, that he says to him, "Drink, Barbu, my master, drink, for God made you an artist and you are greater than me." That's one story. And the second story happened to this guy. You can see in the picture Stefan Dimiter, called Kororo. He's the one sitting on the tool in the middle. He was like a violin player playing in Krakow. And once there was Yehudi Menuhin visiting Krakow, and he was stunned by Kororo's virtuosity. He wanted even to play the violin Kororo has in his hands, but because all the strings were tuned differently, he couldn't. And he started talking, of course, via translators to Kororo, who had no idea about Menuhin. And the story, which is very widespread in Krakow, where I come from, is that Menuhin's remark at the end of the conversation was, well, Stefan doesn't know Menuhin, but Menuhin knows Stefan. But this is, again, the example of the strive for recognition. They really want to be recognized by proper musicians by proper, I mean, the professional musicians as musicians par excellence. The agility of mind, certain cleverness of performing is very important. So this is the question of what they present to people, right? How they present themselves. So musical identity of Gypsy musicians, I would say, is realized as a certain ritual in which their role and place is expressed. So the Gypsy musicians, in their repertoire especially, but also in their looks, they refer to the mythos, the certain myths, the great romantic tradition which I was telling you about. Even before the Second World War, they were written about as great musicians, very gifted, very talented. And they refer to that mythos in their performances. So it is not only about skills, knowledge and taste, but also about accommodating to different cultures and times. Hence, there is no single repertoire, no single mode of performance, but shared tendencies that stem from the deeply embedded and internalized among the gypsies themselves, the idea of who a gypsy musician is. So this is I would say that gypsy musicians conceptualize themselves, or they actually we can look at them through the potential of practice to generate their identity. And this is not only about it is not about the performance, about the repertoire. It is also about the significant appearance. By that, what I mean is here you can see Nikolai Erdenko, for example, with the guitar, but how they actually present themselves to the others. So I'm trying to say that the gypsies are trying to wear clothes that by non-gypsies, that's what they think, by non-gypsies would see these clothes as gypsy. So that's what they think looks gypsy to non-gypsies. So that's what they are wearing for the performances. So you may ask, so what do they wear when they are not performing? There is also a dress code, because they know, they feel the higher level, the higher status among the Romani group. So they always want to look better. So they are really, really dressed up. So even if you talk to them, if you meet them for the interview, they are really always dressed up to the best standard. And I really liked one thing from one Roma who told me, the fashion comes from Milan. And in this sentence, I think there was more than just about the fashion. It was also about, which I will talk about a little bit, about the choice of music they play. That they always follow the latest fashion. They are not behind, never. But what I want to add to that gypsy style also, that this is very interesting. Adopted names, and you would say like what these adopted names are. And this is something which I discovered to my surprise, that certain gypsy musicians adapt the names of very famous composers, but not any composers, but those composers who, usually in the 19th century, when there was this great tradition of gypsy compositions, they would compose pieces either titled as gypsy or Hungarian or Romanian, so something to do with gypsy. Liszt, you know already, but also Brahms, maybe Monti or Strauss. So among gypsy musicians, you can find Strausses because they feel that kind of link with that tradition, so they even stress it in the adopted names. And that kind of appropriation of these composers is really visible and audible in the repertoire, which is the last bit. And here is something which is actually performed by Erdenko. You saw a second ago. He was not only the guitarist, he was also an excellent violinist. And here is the composition called Czardasz. But the point is that it would be presented to you as a listener as Czardasz, Gypsy Czardasz most probably. But if you are a concert hall goer, so you know this is a Czardasz by Monti. So it has a composer who is no gypsy at all. But the gypsy musicians internalize these compositions, these Czardashes by Monti, by Strauss, Hungarian dances by Brahms, why not? Hungarian rhapsodies by Liszt. They play them as their own. So they don't say, oh, this is a piece by a composer. No, they adapt them. But also, that's a very huge question, because is it still, say, Brahms or Strauss, or is it already gypsy music? Because what they do with this music, they adapt this music to their possibilities. So they heavily ornament it. They usually add augmented seconds, which are like immediately connected with gypsy sound. And also, because they are sometimes trained musicians, sometimes just self-taught, they play it often by ear, they add extra passages. So what become the result is now the question. Is it really Liszt? Is it really Monti? Or is it simply gypsy music? So here is an example of such a performance. I think it will play in a second. I'm sorry. Okay, so I'll stop here because otherwise it might repeat. But I just wanted to mention to you that this is, if not
the gypsy so-called version.
Yes, that's what I wanted to say. This is one of the best, if not the best, performance of that particular Czardasz I heard ever. And this is Czardasz that you can buy the scores for, play yourself, and you can hear a lot of other performances with that Czardasz. But this is gypsy interpretation. That's exactly what I wanted to say, that some say that there is no gypsy style as such. This is gypsy interpretation. So this is what they actually do with that music. And
what was gypsy about it?
the ornamentation, the added ornamentation, which is not in the original score. That's one thing. And the second is that it's just the interpretation, like, you know, for example, he prolongs certain notes and shortens others. So this is not written. This is how they say emotional. And so I will just add, some people say that Gypsy musicians are emotional kind of performance, and they are even, I met that kind of expression, they are soul vendors. So they are selling their souls into that music in order to get appreciation.
But aren't you repeating the sort of gypsy cliches, selling cliches?
But they are doing that in order to attract audience, because that's the ultimate.
Has attracted you?
Yes, this is the ultimate result or target. And if we have time, I will tell you the story about how they play out the gypsy ethnicity in an anecdotal kind of story. Because what I wanted to stress also, because now I have the feeling that what they are doing is they are playing with nostalgia for older sounds, like in Chardash. And one thing, this Chardash on the CD is described as Chardash. So it's not Chardash by Monty, as interpreted by Rdenko. It's Chardash. So the assumption is that it's something gypsy, obviously. But I just wanted to show you this following the latest fashions. So they are really, because you might have a feeling right now that gypsy are really clinging to the 19th century great tradition, and they are not really moving forward. So just the example of of styles that are very contemporary and show how they adapt to the situation that is happening right now. In Romania, very disco type of style called manele, connected with banditry and so on, very much looked down upon. But I will tell you more about gypsy disco polo. Disco polo is a kind of disco that is played in Poland with Polish lyrics, and it's adapted a little bit into Polish folklore, but very little. But generally, it's like disco of a very bad quality. And the gypsies seized the opportunity of being there and immediately started playing that type of music. But here I just want to show you a little bit more because it's a video. And in this video you can see the song is in Polish, so you cannot follow really the lyrics, but he's actually using all the cliches about gypsies and doing it in a very self-ironic way. So they are aware of what they are doing. It's not that they are that serious about doing that kind of selling gypsiness to the listeners. Hopefully it will work without problems. Yes. Of course, the wandering gypsy, right? This is the cliche. Also dressed up. Look. In the forest, right, close to the nature, and of course the type of living they would have, which is not true. Bonfire, dancing girls, all into the picture. Yes, Polska Roma, because we have like two big groups, but this is the biggest. And this is a contemporary cliche that gypsies are like nouveau riche nowadays. So I'll stop here. This is the person here he's a musician and activist at the same time, and he's the organizer of a huge Roma festival in Poland for all Romas from the region. I was talking about this being a musician who is updated with the latest fashions. There are obviously some research done on musicians and their self-conceptualization, done among others by Kemp, who says, for example, that if you are a musician, no matter what ethnicity, how old you are, and so on, you share certain features, among others, sensitivity and imagination, and so on. And when I was reading these features, I was thinking, I do not see necessarily my gypsy musicians fitting into that picture. That's not 100% what I would agree with. Because I think, and this is like towards the conclusion, which I skipped, was only the authenticity or search for authenticity. These are not real gypsies that they are performing on stage to be gypsy, and this is another very popular trend, and I'm sure you know it because it's not only about gypsiness. Gypsy musicians, they conceptualize themselves as musicians, but this conceptualization is always embedded into the gypsy origin. Here I have a few quotes. Serbian gypsy Dragan Ristic, who says that he's aware of a strategy to play to the image of gypsy as musicians and singers. But also there is another quote from about Samir Kurtov. He's from Bulgaria, and one researcher who was looking at his life says, and I quote from Piotrowska, that Samir Kurtov, this gypsy musician, builds up his own personal identity in which the dominant factor is the professional rather than ethnical self-identity. He believes he is the best zurna player. Zurna is a kind of instrument, not only in his region, but also in the whole Bulgaria. The basis for this comes not just from his deep feeling for the power of his gift, but also from the acknowledgement by all other zurna players from the region. Samir constructs his individual identity as part of a local group of zurna players, but also as someone above their level by the power of his individual talents. He is at the same time close to and distant from his musician partners. Close because he needs them to be able to reliably and creatively interpret his inherited musical style and his birth environment. Distanced because the music vibrates in him with greater intensity than in his partners. End of a quote. So just to sum up, or maybe not to sum up, just to open up the window, I was thinking about the future of gypsy musicians, and I really don't know if the future is in the streets. That's one possibility, because before my coming here on Friday, I was walking down Krakow main streets, and there were gypsy musicians playing in the streets, so they are there. Or the future of gypsy musicians is connected with the gypsiness as such. And when I was thinking about it a few times, I talked to other people who are doing research on gypsies, and I started comparing my conclusions and my thoughts, and someone told me that apparently, I haven't checked that apparently, and I strongly believe this is the truth, the same thing is happening with the artists, like painters, who are now, gypsy painters, who want to be recognized as painters, full stop, not as gypsy painters. But at the same time, they never forget about the gypsy origin. So they are painters of gypsy origin. They are gypsy as painters, or painters as gypsy. Very difficult to put it into the words, but I think this is, again, the duality or doubleness of the situation is reflected in the pan of these words. Thank you for having me and listening.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting. I have a family in Hungary still, and I once heard a joke on on gypsies of Roma who goes to the Yehudim concert, and after the concert, people ask them, how do you think on the way he plays? So I say he's good, but he would never make it at the table. So it seems, but it says more, but because it seems that in many cultures there is this something, these gypsies, and it's in more than one culture, that these virtuosic players or artists who are not entirely or not at all civilized, but they are holding some sort of ancient skills, and I think that you can see it in the whole world of strings. In guitar players in the United States in the early 20th century, some of them were gypsies and developed the electric guitar. So this whole world of strings and this whole image of someone who can manipulate this world into something supreme yet not civilized, it seems like to me like a passion of the people who call these people gypsies. Because so how, I mean, do you recognize such a tendency in cultures regarding music?
I think I know what you mean. One thing is like in the 19th...
First, I think what most of us don't know enough is what gypsies are. We have no idea what this is. Is this a thing? Are they really an ethnic group? You said Roma and there are others. Who are those others?
Okay.
So could you just give us a very brief introduction so that we know
Okay.
what you're talking
Okay. So the history of so maybe I will start with one thing which I didn't say in my paper, that I told you that I will offer one more explanation why Gypsy, not Roma, and the other is that Gypsy musicians, when they are interviewed and you are very polite and politically correct and you say Roma, and they say no, we are not Roma. Roma are activists. We are Gypsy. Which is very telling, because this is again playing this ethnicity for musical reasons. But your question is, who are the Roma or who are the Gypsies? These are the people who appeared in, again, we don't know, in 12th century at least, they are for sure in Europe, and they most probably came from India, but this is like 99% theory, but most authors would say this is the truth. But some still have doubts. So we are not sure, but most probably they come from the East and they came to Europe, and by the 16th century they reached even the Great Britain, and the 15th century France and Spain. So this is the pilgrimage. These people were of the same origin, most probably, but during that time, from the 15th century or 12th century till 20th century, they divided into several groups. And this division went on several levels. One level is the professional level. So if you were a musician, you would stick together with other musicians. If you were a blacksmith, you would stick with other blacksmiths, and so on and so forth. So even this is reflected in the names. So we've got the gypsies who are called lautari, musicians. They are called Calderashi and so on, so those who were horse traders and so on. So that's one level of division. But the other level of division was, of course, the countries where they stayed in for longer. They were itinerary, but more or less traveling within certain regions. So that's why now we talk about Polska Roma, which means Polish Roms, and Ruska Roma, Russian Roms. They are connected often, interrelated, but different groups. But also in Spain, they were very much under different circumstances and conditions. So there they are called Gitanos, and they are quite different from Hungarian Romas.
That's what I'm asking. Is there such a thing as gypsies? And what constitutes gypsiness? Because there is such a thing as Jews, I'm not sure. But let's say there is at least a Jewish religion. So Jews everywhere have certain common, tenets of faith, certain common religious practices, etc. You could question, you could wonder whether these are enough to make them a people. What makes
gypsies and people. Of course, there is a question.
You're a Nazi. You have an answer.
This is not. Some people say that this is a nation. That gypsies are a nation without a land, just like Jews were.
What makes a Turkish gypsy, a Spanish
So
gypsy?
if I was to give you like one strong, like very essentialist answer, there is a code of morale called Romanipen. So this is the conduct, how you should behave being a gypsy.
And they all behave like it? So
They
if
are
you're
supposed to
a
behave
Greek
like
gypsy,
that.
a Spanish gypsy, an English gypsy, and a Turkish gypsy,
Yes.
they will all obey the code?
They should, because this is what you are supposed to do when you are a gypsy. And if you don't follow that code, you may be excluded from the group, which was in the previous times was a terrible thing because you didn't belong to anyone. Like you didn't belong to the mainstream, you didn't belong to the gypsies. And also you could be punished by the I don't know how to call it, the board of older people who would judge you. They had their own system of not courts, but
I take it this is an oral code, right?
yes, everything is in oral.
Everything is oral. So how do people in Turkey and people in England maintain more or less the same code?
I'm not. This is nowadays. This is not. I wouldn't say that this is exactly the same code, but this is like the core of it remains the same, because that's the tradition. They are not supposed to change things, but they do change, and that's the problem because that's the modernity. For example, gypsy women are not supposed to wear trousers. Full stop. That's the story, and nowadays most young girls do, and this is. I'm not saying this is appreciated, but this is not condemned by the seniority. So how does it work? But if you are in Hungary, for example, I will come back to your question, and you are looking for gypsies in the street, you will surely see some women wearing long skirts with apron on it. And even if you don't know if they are gypsies, judging by the looks, you will know they are gypsies, because this is the code.
Is this real or is this the cliche? If I dress up like this, if you dressed up like this, you'd be a gypsy.
No, I wouldn't be, but this is indebted into the tradition. So this is like performing tradition. If you are doing something because you are pretending something because you like it, that's one thing. That doesn't make you a gypsy. But they are wearing these clothes because they feel they have to. This is the tradition. So that's, I believe, they are.
Is this for outsiders? You just said that
No.
many women nowadays wear trousers, but when they perform, they will always wear long.
Yes.
Like,
Yes, but if you see them in the streets just walking by, they are not performing, they are doing it just because they feel this is the code they are obeying.
Okay.
And I don't, sometimes, I'm colorblind, sometimes I really don't know in Hungary or in Romania, I don't know if I'm talking to a gypsy or non-gypsy person because of the skin complexion. For me, it's not clear. But I know from my Hungarian friends that for them, it's very clear. Immediately they say who is gypsy and who is not. I was really surprised, but maybe it comes into your blood when you live in a country when there are so many.
People could always recognize us. Anti-Semites could always think, yeah. Could they really? I don't know. Jews were supposedly highly visible. Anyone could see and say, a Jew. You could tell by our noses.
You know, with gypsies, it's a problem because, for example, there are a lot of blonde and blue eyes gypsies nowadays because they mixed a lot. So they mixed a lot in the history, and now it's really like they don't look gypsy, and they are. And then with these solar things, a lot of girls, for me, look like a gypsy type. They are not. So it's really confusing. So this is really self-recognition. When someone conceptualizes himself or herself as a gypsy more than nowadays, than following the code, because as I said, the code is not followed so much, but still in the 50s or the 60s, in Poland, it was followed.
Just one brief, just to finish this before
Yes.
we answer way. So is there really such a thing as gypsy music? Is there?
That's a huge
Does it
question.
exist?
That's why I presented.
What is being distorted? Is there anything to distort?
That's why I presented you so many musical examples, because I wanted to show you that even now, with that knowledge, if you were to answer that question, would you be able? And I've been studying the problem for so many years, and I really don't know, because what you are looking for is this essentialist answer. Like the essence of gypsy music is, and you've got 5 features. And
I'm happy to say that there is no such thing.
But I'm not happy to say there is no, because there are certain situations when you immediately recognize, oh, this must be gypsy playing or performing, because there is something, and this is very intangible. Yes, some people say that it's like, it depends on the style of interpretation, maybe, or I think now, recently I started thinking it's about something about tempi, that you play with time with that music. So the time is really like, it's like aporia of time. So it is playing with the length of notes, and very, very, very much the effect of the contrast. So very, very, very long, slow, very quick, very emotional, very quiet. And playing these extremes is very typical. But then you can say, okay, but it is also typical for others. So, for example, augmented second as well, which is very exotic, which brings me back to your question. This is something about the 19th and late 18th century discourse of exoticism in music, which was connected first with Turks. Actually, I didn't mention that, but gypsies in the late 18th century, they proclaimed a little bit that they are, or maybe not proclaimed, that they filled in the place which was released by Turkish musicians after the siege of Vienna. So there was something exotic about that music, something from the Eastern, right? So I think this untamable, right? And that was really written about in the 18th century and the 19th century about gypsies from Spain, a lot about that, also about Russian gypsies. So they are like exotic but untamable and wild. This word wild would appear. So maybe this is something that gypsy musicians still have in mind and play with that. Because this kind of primitiveness, I don't like this word, but this is the word that was in musicological writing about gypsy music and gypsy musicians who are improvising, that was present in the 20th century musicological thought of, for example, German writings. So that there is some kind of primitivism connected with that kind of performance you are talking about.
Okay, these are exactly what, in this encounter between white cultures and
so-called
othernesses, it can be black, it can be oriental, so there is always these people who are not totally in tune.
They're very passionate.
Yeah,
yes, that's true.
And they hold some skills that we don't, and we forgot them. And many times, I'm trying to say that I mean, it comes more from the interpretation of the hegemonic.
Yes, from
rather than
from within.
From who these people are.
The problem with gypsy music is connected with what you said. Who are the gypsy? Do they have the core of the gypsiness? And if they had the core of the gypsiness, we could claim that there is such a thing as gypsy music, folklore gypsy music. And this is the source of their elaboration of classical music and so on. But the problem is that most probably there is no such a thing as gypsy folklore music. But now certain people will say, no, of course there is. It was just that during the migrations, they accumulated features from here and there and there and there. But all along, what was the result was the accumulation of these features. But the core, the kernel, is really gypsy. So when you start doing that and undressing that music, there is nothing that is purely gypsy. So I cannot see anything like that. I would say this is like always fluid and in construction. This is
haphazard and improvising.
Yes, and also.
And this is why strings are so popular, because they don't have to read notes. This is why when Jimi Hendrix, one of his bands, he called it band of gypsies.
Gypsy band, yeah, of course.
And Django Reinhardt, who played with two fingers,
yes.
right?
Yeah.
He was
Gypsy, but he
Yeah.
also played with non-gypsies, and still the music would be called Gypsy. That's very important. That it's enough
Then
if you have one.
familiar with
sorry.
that is distinguished by its music from the different cultures that you study? Specific music, I don't know, Cossack music, klezmer music.
Klezmer music,
stuff that
yes.
is distinctly ethnic.
You've got Georgian music, for example, which is like very, very like ethnically, and this is polyphony, which is like people singing in polyphony. Which, when you hear it, it's like you cannot mistake it with anything else in the world. So you would know Georgian polyphony.
Yes, please.
Thank you for your very interesting presentation. That really that with gazes of others on gypsies and gypsy gazing on others.
Yeah.
But what do gypsies play for themselves?
That's the question that we are asked quite often. They actually,
Music.
yeah, because that would answer all the questions. Look at what they play at home or what they sing at home. You've got gypsy music. End of the question. But the problem is that they play the same things that they would play outside, but with the difference that they would sing at homes, because they can be understood whichever language they use. They might be using Romani, or they might be using the language of the country they are staying in, which is more popular. But quite often you've got this very, very typical situations where there is a song with new lyrics but old tune. So you have to look for the tune, but you will surely discover it from Hungary, from Romania, from 18th century. Or you've got the other way around, you've got old lyrics but new tune, which is lambada, was very popular in the Balkans among the gypsies. So,
Gypsy Kings, I suppose.
but also but also Gypsy Kings, but lambada, which came from was like, I think it was Latin America, and they actually changed a little bit the rhythm. So that's why I'm prone to think that playing with the rhythm, with the time of how they actually articulate music, is very important for them. They changed a little bit the rhythm, but the tune, the pitches were the same, but they of course gave their own lyrics. So that's what they play and sing at home. So I'm sorry.
It goes also to your question. I was thinking about Jewish music in the Middle East and North Africa, which is what I study. And the music itself is really similar to Arab
Music, yes.
But when they sing it in Hebrew and all, like liturgy, from liturgy or folk music.
Exactly.
No, but there's certain things, it always strikes me. People are thinking, for example, about six-sulim, so these vocal ornamentations as typically Oriental, so to speak, Jewish Oriental.
Right.
If you look at any Jewish Ashkenazi Chazanut, I mean, what is it? If not that, I mean, these things are not defined as simsul, they are defined as something else.
Right.
So I think in some ways, like certain things, some of the stuff that we sing in Orient, so Sephardic Jews sing in synagogues, maybe Arabs, but some of it are Latino, and some of it, in fact, is French pop music, everything, Turkish music, everything. But it was.
It's a combination in a way, right?
It's Jewish.
Yeah.
Yes, but please.
Thank you. I have two questions. The first is actually continues Alon's questions. I wanted to ask you about the use in the term identity, because what we saw, I felt, is kind of performance of one's identity to be other, and it's less connected or expressed like more sense of self-identification or belonging. So it's like a different category, a different layer of identity. And I wanted to ask you, in continuing with Alon's question about like how the community itself identify with music or with itself, and how it's different when performing. And secondly, and it's also related to the examples that you gave, and maybe there are others. All of the examples were male Gypsy musicians. And I wanted to know what role gender plays in creating Gypsy
Okay.
music.
So maybe I'll start with the second question because it's very easy. Musicians are, this is male job. Because I don't, but very funny because in Gypsy tradition, it was the woman who was sent to the streets to beg.
So women dance and men sing?
Yes,
Men play?
men play. One of the possible explanation, excuse me, was that when women sing, it was less threatening for the mainstream society. So you can see the women who are weak, who are begging, singing, dancing, maybe. But with the musical activities, it's more like showing that you are a competition to musicians from the mainstream society. So they were not really sent to work like that in the first place. So it's men. So it's really male thing.
So women never play violin?
There was one example of so-called Panna Cinka. She was that was 18th century. She is legendary, but it's actually the true person. We don't know much about her life, but she was very well educated and she was playing, and she had her own Zigorny Kapellen, one Panna Cinka. Nowadays, we've got Gypsy female singers. They try their careers. Also, flamenco performers are like sometimes singers, but musicianship is more in male family line. But the first question is like more about this belonging to the group and identity of the group versus individual. One thing very important, I always talk to musicians who are performing in public for money. So this is also like the constraints of what I'm doing. I'm not doing it with a gypsy who happens to play at home and I wouldn't know that. I talk only to those who actually explicitly do it in the streets or on stage. So that is also my approach, right? So to those who are identifying with that as beruf, as job, professionally. And the second thing is, I promised that anecdote, and maybe that anecdote will answer your question. It is a little bit more metaphorical, not so much connected with music, about how Gypsy conceptualize themselves. So a friend of mine, also a researcher, but sociologist, wanted to make research a questionnaire with a gypsy. Could be gypsy musician, it didn't matter to her. So she asked me to recommend someone. I recommended one gypsy musician, actually Sinti. Sinti is a group from Germany. But because of a closeness with Poland, some Sinti also live in Poland and they are very proud of being Sinti. They are also gypsy, but they call themselves Sinti. That's a difference only. And that was a situation, like after the conference, we had a dinner. So we were seated at a restaurant, public space, and we were talking. And suddenly, next to my table, there is a huge crying, like, wow, what? Everybody's looking there, and my gypsy musician is like yelling at that researcher, saying like, what questions are you asking me? That's impertinent, never, and so on. So she comes to me and she says, you know what? I asked him the questions, which I told him what sort of questions I would be asking him. I need them only for my research, so he knows this is not my private interest in his life. It's just for research. He knew what type of questions he would be asked. And nevertheless, he reacted like that. Next person who comes to me is he. And he comes to me and he says, what questions she asked me? You cannot imagine. But, and this is very important, but with you, it's different. If you asked me these questions, I would answer them without problems. So you see, this is how they conceptualize themselves vis-a-vis others. Like, you never know. And then I was actually, to end that story, I was really thinking about that. Because I don't know how in Hebrew or in English, but in Polish at least, the word gypsy is a synonym to gypsy, means to lie, to be a liar.
Oh yes, it's like in Spanish, to Jew is to lie, in English for that matter, yeah.
I didn't know that, but in Polish, right, so I'm very... maybe, so cyganić. In Polish, cyganić means
Russian also.
Doesn't mean to lie, but
Cheat.
cheat, to cheat or to lie, or like, yes, something like that.
it's the same in Russian.
Yes, so I am very conscious not to use that word anymore. But that's the stereotype that gypsies lie. But then, okay, so he was lying. We can say that, we can take it as a statement. He was lying. But aren't we all lying in all different situations? When someone asks you something, you are not telling the whole truth. You are saying 80%, 70%, 50% maybe. You are not lying, but you are not revealing everything. But you are not gypsy, so you are not lying. But if you are a gypsy, then yes, he was lying, right? So this is again that type of seeing that through our eyes.
Yes, please.
Sorry.
You led us to listen to some songs, and one of the songs I was sure 100% it's old Russian song. It's not a gypsy song. So
Maybe
so-
more old Russian.
And I want to know, do this musician play only old songs, or did they have new repertoire, new songs? And another question, I know a lot, and almost everything I know about Gypsy culture is from Russian movies.
Nie, taboru Hadidy nie było.
Yes, and also some more. And
I know that.
I know
It's really
that,
big.
Gypsy women are not supposed to marry.
Non-gypsy men.
Yes, and also they are not supposed to live in the houses. They are supposed to live outside the city, in their communities. Do they succeed to maintain their way of life in Poland and other countries?
Okay, so with romances, that's a huge question. I was doing my research in St. Petersburg, and I went through tons of Russian and Gypsy romances, and they were like interchangeably. So the titles, it seemed that whoever gave the titles, the editor most probably, didn't care. Some were titled Gypsy, and some were titled Russian. How to identify, how to make the difference? When I looked musically at them, absolutely the same. And of course, the lyrics were both in Russian here and there. So it is really a question like what is really Gypsy, or what was appropriated by the Gypsies in the 20s and 30s with the Cyganszczyzna movement, right? That was...
What was the name of that musician, the one who was in charge?
Erdenko. That was a whole family of Gypsy musicians, not only one.
The Ukrainian?
No, they are Russian. Russian, I think. But maybe I'm mistaken. But I think, yeah. This one for sure was Russian, but the other might have been Ukrainian. So that's a huge question, right? They are open to new repertoire? That's for sure. They are not sticking to the old repertoire. Just the opposite. You remember, fashion comes from Milan, so you always have to be updated. That's very, very important. And about us sticking to traditions. In Poland, actually, there is a small, we don't have a huge percentage of gypsies. So it's more appropriate to ask about gypsies in Slovakia, Bulgaria, and Romania and Hungary about these questions. I must say that in the cities, of course, now we've got lots of gypsy people going to a university, music academies, and so on. But in the villages, the situation is really different. That's where also the situation with having large families and starting families at the age of 15, because it's a blessing. It is still there, and despite the governmental efforts to prevent situations like that, they still stick to their old role traditions. So this is what you actually asked, like, if they obey, if they do follow. It depends obviously on the level of education. But there are lots of places less educated that they actually do. And in Slovakia, last time I was there, you could see barefooted gypsies who were begging for a few penny and would do anything for you just to get some money. So, and they were really living in poor conditions. I even don't know the word in English, but when you build up your house from clay, paper, some ground, and that's how they lived. And so at least a few years ago, it was reality in the middle of Europe.
Yes, please.
Thank you. The samples that we heard, these two of them sound to me, and I'm not definitely not an expert, like klezmer music, and also the dominance of the violin and the fast and slow tempo. So my question is, what is the connection and difference between klezmer music and
Yes.
and gypsy?
And that's a good question because in a lineup of klezmer music and gypsy bands, you can see, clarinets, fiddlers, and dulcimer. Maybe it's not so much in klezmer music, but in old school, there was a kind of competition between gypsies and Jews in countryside of Ukraine or Poland, because they both play dulcimer. Dulcimer, like hanging on the rope. So not the big one. The big one was later. That was the late 19th century. So yes, there are many, because they were like village musicians. I'm sure they exchange the ideas or listen to one another. But also the clarinet and the fiddlers are very typical. The second thing is the augmented second, which I mentioned a few times. It's like something which European ear would recognize as Eastern or as exotic. And this is in klezmer music, this is in gypsy music. So again, there is something which is like imposed, at least on gypsy music. I'm not sure about klezmer music, but on gypsy music it was imposed, but still they share it. And the third thing is, and I think you will be really surprised when you listen to that, is the musicians themselves. After the war, after the war, a lot of Jewish musicians, at least in Poland, and that's the situation I know personally, were jobless. Like they couldn't find they were klezmers before the war, right? And when they survived, they couldn't play in restaurants or inns anymore. So what they were employed as by the communist authorities was as directors, musical directors of these ensembles, these folkloristic ensembles. And I told you that gypsy music was folklore, right? And in Poland we had also like gypsy bands as folklore. And one of the most famous klezmer in Poland, he's even called the last klezmer, Kozłowski, Leopold Kozłowski, he worked for, 30 or 40 years as the musical director of a group called the Roma in Krakow. So when I was doing a workshop on gypsy music, he was the guest of honor, and all gypsies would call him uncle. Uncle is the highest recognition given to someone in the gypsy community. And so that really answers a lot, because what else could he be doing, like with the Roma? Of course, the Roma brought their own material, but he had the ear trained on klezmer music as a musician. And obviously, that is a little bit aside. A lot of intermarriages between Jews and gypsies, maybe because of musical connections, but also because of Auschwitz situation happens. Because actually, gypsies in their culture, again, one of the role is that you treasure your dead ones. So you tend to settle there where they were buried and where they died. So that's why after the Second World War, the large community of Polish gypsies, or not only Polish, but nowadays they live in Polish, actually moved to Oświęcim. They live in, yes. So my students at Jagiellonia University, most of them are from Oświęcim, yes. And I know that there were intermarriages, and even the Polish, one of the most active activists, Roma activists, his second wife is of Jewish origin. So I know that this is happening quite often. So that's to answer your question and even further.
Last question. Yes, please.
Marina.
Thank you so much. I would just maybe to add something to the discussion, and the question arose about similarity between gypsy and klezmer music. What I thought about it, the common denominator is landless communities. Actually, they are not agrarian in European or other societies. They have no their land, and they have no their folklore. So they perform, they maintain folklore mistakenly would recognize the same Ukrainian song. If it is sung by a gypsy, we hear gypsy music. If it is sung by a Jewish musician, we hear Jewish music. And expression, articulation, and this is very similar with the jazz phenomenon, because it's the same language black people and their unique expression. And it can be given to commonly known music. So it's very interesting phenomenon. I developed a theory about vernacularity in music, and it's very...
So I could only add that this is also about music as something which is not connected with a land, with a place, but it's like placeless, and placeless people as a music being part of the identity of conceptualization. This is a really important thing, I think. This is what you are trying to say more or less. I would think, because when you say about blacks and Jews and gypsies, and maybe we could have other examples, when music becomes at the core of the identification for certain people. Yeah. But this is, yes, maybe it is just very in situ thought, but I think that might be a little bit knocking on the door of the truth, right?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.